just so I have a better understanding where you guys are. How long has the class been going on for you? What do you guys are really, I guess, learning about DevOps? I know it's a pretty broad topic, but anybody want to volunteer?
Like 3 or 4 weeks.
I'm sorry?
Like 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay, and is there any, like, I guess, particular topics that you're covering now, just so I have at least some type of idea on what you guys know?
Agile development and Kanban.
Gotcha. Anything about the methodologies or what types of, I guess, what DevOps role would entail at all? Okay, cool. Well, that's good then, because that's pretty much what I'm going to cover. Probably maybe a little bit more in depth on what the job market's like or what exactly people do when they're in a DevOps position, depending on the company. So, could certainly start. What I would like to do as well would be if anybody has any questions during the talk, by all means just raise your hand and just ask. It's better than just piling up a bunch at the end. It'd probably be nicer as like an actual conversation too. So just don't want to just be blabbering the whole time. Any questions before I start? Cool. So a little bit about myself, my company. My company's Salt. Basically what we do is we're a recruitment company, so we'll help other companies find the right people. Usually when companies are going through some type of what we call digital transformation, and that's a pretty big buzzword that a lot of people throw around, but digital transformation, at least in terms of IT and DevOps, it's usually when companies are trying to get into maybe some type of cloud native environment or trying to move into best DevOps practices, something along those lines. So what Salt can do is actually we find the right people that'll do not only DevOps, but also tech, creative roles, sales roles, even marketing as well. So we can pretty much help entire companies do that by finding the right people. As far as what I do exactly, I only specialize in filling DevOps and site reliability positions. So I'll always find those types of people, always network with those people, host different events, etc. Why I chose DevOps in the first place? I guess the main thing is because I was working in a market that was only just strictly Microsoft technologies. And by that, it was, say, just finding, say, people that worked with .NET or maybe things like Dynamics CRM or Dynamics AX. And I have to say, the market that I was working in, it was pretty much, I guess you could say, I don't want to say shriveling up, but it wasn't as exciting for candidates, wasn't as exciting for companies. When I started doing some research and finding what DevOps was, or I guess Amazon and even Google Cloud, that seemed like a market that people were way more interested in. So that's what I want to be a part of as well. And that's why I started at least looking for companies that were specializing in hiring people in those areas. And that's how Salt and I found each other. Yeah.
I don't think we've covered the term site reliability engineer.
Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Yeah, has anybody heard that term yet? SRE, or site reliability? It's pretty much within DevOps, and I think I'm going to touch on it in a little bit as well. There are a lot of different terms that are used to describe the same thing. You'll hear DevOps. Some DevOps roles, they'll call them site reliability engineers. I know, and that's something that Spotify uses. That's something that Google came out with. Google's idea of a DevOps engineer is an SRE. Facebook will call them product engineers, or production engineers rather. I forget who else. Some other big one just uses operations engineers. And I'll cover that as well, how there are different companies that'll determine what DevOps is based on their environment, and they'll define it differently. Yeah, the backgrounds, they're pretty interesting because DevOps, if you want to call it that, it's probably been around for, say, 6-7 years, at least formally, out there. There's a lot of debate around that too. Some people say it's only been around 2 years. Other people say they've been doing it for 10 or 12, and those are usually the ones that are beefing up their resumes too much. But usually, because there's always been automation, which DevOps tends to be a lot of anyway, around for quite some time. But usually there are two types of backgrounds that I find. I'm not sure what each year is studying necessarily outside of DevOps, but the grand majority of candidates I find, they'll usually have operations backgrounds, or they'll be, say, Linux admins by trade, systems engineers by trade. The real tech expertise, I'm sure you guys could probably even understand and justify way more than me. But that's, say, about 70 to 80% of people out there are coming with those backgrounds. And maybe as far as the development part, they'll do some type of scripting with, like, say, Python or Bash or something like that. But they're not really hardcore programming, so to speak. The real much rarer people out there are probably developers by trade, people who were maybe Java developers previously, people who were programming for maybe 5-6 years before and then wanted to become a DevOps engineer. Out of curiosity, is there anyone that I guess could even define what DevOps might be, or at least what you guys have learned so far? any, I guess, real topics you guys are going over as far as what DevOps is?
Well, our first talk was on what DevOps is, so hopefully someone can answer. Come on, guys. Someone be bold.
It doesn't have to be overly fancy either, just so I'm not rambling on without any direction for you.
You have a...
Yeah, go for it.
DevOps is a method or concept to automate the development process.
Okay, cool. And that's more or less what I find when companies come to me asking for someone who can actually bring that new methodology, bring that best practice. It's not just coding away. It's not just doing operations work either. It's really helping companies make that cultural change. So there are a lot of people out there that will even say they don't believe in even calling the job title a DevOps engineer. It's almost like saying, at least some people have defined it as saying an agile engineer. It's something that doesn't necessarily exist. But again, that's just a debate that a lot of people have. Anyway, so the different backgrounds will either be from, say, a pretty strong admin background or a pretty strong programming background. The grand majority will be pretty heavy on the ops, but and that's where the limitations come in. Usually the heavy ops people will only be scripting to some extent, whereas the developers may not have all the different, say, Linux or admin expertise. So that's pretty self-explanatory there. But the job titles, like I said, there are a lot of companies out there that'll just because they think it's a hot buzzword, they'll call it a DevOps engineer, bless you, when it's really when the role is really just strictly for a programmer or an engineer by trade. They'll maybe throw a few different tools out there that they're using, like maybe Kubernetes for microservices or Docker, or things like Jenkins they'll be using, but it's not necessarily going to be someone that's going to bring that change. So that's something that I've really seen out there, where there'll be like just misused job titles out there just to attract candidates, because DevOps is such a hot thing, when it's not really a role where they need someone to make the change. They'll already maybe be in a DevOps environment right now where that change has already been made and they just need a new developer. So that's one thing that I would recommend looking out for if you are looking for DevOps roles, just to make sure that just really not just reading the job description either, just really having genuine questions for the employer about what you'd actually be doing. And if there's a third background that I see that's actually arising, that might sound a little cheesy, but it's probably going to be you guys in all reality. People who don't know anything better than DevOps methodologies, not the 20-year admins who have just learned DevOps 2 years ago, or not the 3 or 4 or 5-year programmers out there that are learning what DevOps is now because it's quite good for their careers. And there are a couple people that I work with right now, actually, candidates that I'm working with, candidates that we're finding new roles out there for, that have only been DevOps engineers for 2 years or 3 years. They've really come in quite, I guess you can say, clean to what DevOps is, and they don't know any better. They don't have old habits that they're trying to break, or they're not stuck in their old admin ways. So that's what I find pretty interesting. So for now, the grand majority are going to be the two different ones, admin or developer by trade. But as time goes on, I'm just starting to see more site reliability engineers out there, DevOps engineers that have been at it for 2-3 years, and their first job out of college was pretty DevOps-y, so to speak. So that's what I think is one of the more interesting parts, and that's how quickly the market can move.
Michael,
Yeah.
I apologize. I should have put you into slideshow view.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You just get the menus off and stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Better.
Yeah, good call.
Oh.
Slideshow. Not the most.
Menu. We can.
View.
Yeah.
Or you can press the play button, the slideshow play button, above insert on the header.
That one?
Yeah, I think that just works. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
This will film better.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so perception of DevOps, and that's something that I think I got into a little bit, but it's something that I see more and more when companies, they'll come to me and say, we need a DevOps engineer. Then it's my job to really qualify the role. What exactly are you looking for? Is it the type of skill set that actually exists out there, or is it something that's quite new? Because so many companies have their own different definition, from much larger companies that take a much longer time to get into a DevOps mindset, whereas there are short or small cloud native startups that are already quite DevOps-y as it is, because they have to be working very quickly. So anyway, usually a type of company, if it's a finance company, let's say, much larger organization, or maybe even a huge pharmaceutical company out there, they're going to be, their idea of DevOps is going to be very different than, say, a cloud native 20-person startup, because they'll have a lot of legacy issues that they'll have to deal with. They'll have, and usually their idea of DevOps will only be maybe one or two interesting things that other companies are doing. They're not going to really be full, so to speak. And other companies out there, they'll even think that they'll just be buying DevOps, which that's another debate that you'll see out there. And when I say buying DevOps, just because they'll maybe be using, say, AWS, or they'll hire a DevOps engineer just to fix their lack of DevOps. That's not the case. Again, they still need this person to bring the cultural change. They still need the person to get other engineers on board. They still need to get other people on board with what DevOps is. So it's not just having someone who's done it before, or at least work with these tools. It's not just tools. It's, again, that methodology, which I can't say enough. And the level of autonomy as well. If it's, say, a larger bank or pharmaceutical company that can't necessarily, how can I put it, be in the cloud just due to privacy reasons or security reasons, or companies that are only just doing a little bit of config management or a little CI/CD, they'll probably have, maybe, if it's a larger company, they'll have probably 5 or 6 people doing it. Whereas if it's a small cloud native startup, they'll only have one person doing everything. So usually the smaller companies, you get way more autonomy out there, just because you kind of have to wear multiple hats. You have to do everything because it's only one of you. And then, does a company need a cultural change? Where's their DevOps environment? Well-oiled machine by now. And that's usually where, yeah, that's pretty much when a company does need a brand new DevOps engineer, someone who's maybe done it before, someone who has helped the company change. Usually the people that are, say, quite new out of college haven't necessarily had that experience yet. So their best bet would be to be working with a company that's already in a DevOps environment, who are leveraging best DevOps practices. And this is where, at least what I find when I'm qualifying a role, this is only the technical stuff. It's not if someone's brought the change. It's not if someone has helped the company really make that digital transformation. But have you guys seen any of these yet, like CI/CD or configuration management? Have you guys touched on any of those yet? Yeah.
Yeah, we gotta use CI/CD.
Okay, so these.
And Docker is our container environment, so we're running Docker.
Oh, cool. Okay, because I'm not sure if you guys know or not. I'm sure you've probably touched on it as well. But in terms of, say, CI/CD tools, I mean, I'm sure it sounds familiar. Something like Jenkins. That's the one that grand majority of companies will use. But then there are all different ones. It's not just do you use Jenkins or not. There are different ones like TeamCity or Circle CI or Travis CI. Tons of them out there. There are other ones that companies will use internally that they've created themselves. And usually when people are looking for a new role, some people will just say throw different tools on their resume hoping something sticks, whereas it doesn't really matter about the tools. It's like pretty much have you leverage those tools in a certain way. Same thing goes for configuration management. You know, tools like Chef or Puppet or Red Hat's Ansible or even SaltStack, which we get confused with a lot, even though we're not Salt by any means. But tools like that as well, they all do pretty much the same thing. Maybe they'll have different nuances. Maybe some of their nuances will help companies in a certain way. Like maybe some of them will have a nuance around security, or maybe one moves faster than another, or maybe one's made for enterprise rather than small companies. It depends. But I know something like containers as well. That's something that's moved very quickly, which I think I'm going to touch on in another slide. But I know you guys have talked about Docker, obviously. Then there are ones that are orchestration tools that go a little deeper. I don't know if you guys have heard of maybe something like Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or Mesos. The technical expertise part, I'm sure one of my DevOps engineers would have a much better idea on how to explain. But basically, that's where they get a little deeper. And those are the newer the containers or the newer tools out there, a lot of companies just want to hop on. It's not always right for these companies, but they just want to hop on them because it's like the hot new tech. So usually it depends on if they're leveraging them the right way, if they're just using these tools because they think they're supposed to. And then the languages out there, any of the coding languages, some DevOps people, some roles will need them because they'll need more DevOps engineers, and then others, they won't. They'll just need you to script in something like Bash or Python or even Shell. So that it just depends on how deep they need you to be on the dev side. And then the clouds out there. Do you guys know any different cloud infrastructures? Any of those ring a bell? Yeah.
AWS?
Yeah, definitely. That's probably the one that the grand majority of companies use right now. Any others that come to mind? I'm sorry?
Google.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's 3. And there are definitely others out there. Those are definitely the big three in the world of DevOps. I know Azure tends to be tougher for companies. I'm not sure if this is stuff that you guys already know or not, but apparently Windows environments are much more difficult to automate in. So the grand majority of companies out there, it's AWS all the way. So that's what you'll be seeing on job descriptions. That's what you'll be seeing on, at least that's what I see on people's resumes all the time. And some companies, they'll have maybe just proof of concepts. They're not necessarily going to be in production environments. And that's what tends to be tough when people make a transition in roles. I'm sure after leaving this class, you guys will be looking for probably your first DevOps role or first technical role out there. But when people are making moves to other companies from one to another, probably the biggest sticking point I see out there, it's if, with any of these tools actually, Jenkins or let's say Chef or Docker or Kubernetes or even AWS or GCP, probably the biggest challenge would be if they're with a much larger company, like a bank or a pharmaceutical company, like I always go back to. They're nice to be employed by, they have great benefits. I mean, you're taken care of course, and the salaries are nice and high. But you're not necessarily going to be, again, as DevOps, you're not going to be using these tools always in production. It'll just be a test environment or a proof of concept. And that's what makes it tough when people look for a new role. Because a lot of these companies, not just the cloud native startups, but even the big ones, they still want to see people that have worked with it in production. So if there's one thing I'd recommend about specific tools, it wouldn't be which ones are better or worse. It's more about, have you worked with all these different types to some extent in production? That's just huge. So after your first role and you look for your second, that's what I would recommend. If you can find a company that will let you use these things in production, that's huge. Or they may be a year or 3 years out from it. So usually small to mid helps you do that. Any questions so far? Anything that comes to mind? Company, yeah, and I pretty much touched on that so far pretty heavily because cloud native startups, they'll usually let you, how can I put it? They usually let you be able to use those things in production, and also they'll be able to let you have more responsibility. So, but those tend to be the ones that you learn way more in. And that's what I thought was interesting too, like what would be better to learn in. Obviously, as I'm sure you can tell, I'm starting to get way more into smaller companies that you can learn from. Sure, those are great, but if it's your first role, it's always nice to have some type of mentor. I'm sure it's just common sense, but that's what I always recommend to people that maybe it's their first or second DevOps role. A lot of people, maybe they're 2 or 3 years into the workforce, so to speak, in the DevOps world. And they'll only have maybe worked with a company that they were the only, again, DevOps person, so to speak. And maybe they were surrounded by senior developers or maybe a couple like senior Linux admins, but they didn't really get to learn how to leverage best DevOps practices. They might have had a couple cool tools on their resume and they got the job as like a junior DevOps engineer. I always recommend, it doesn't always necessarily matter which exact company, even the big ones or the small ones. If there's a mentor in there that you'll be reporting into, like let's say a senior site reliability engineer or a senior DevOps engineer, that's really going to be way better because it's going to be one-on-one. I learned way better one-on-one. There are other companies out there that are, say, larger teams that have multiple DevOps engineers in there. That's fine too, but it's always nice to at least have some type of mentor out there rather than just being dropped and do DevOps, so to speak. It's pretty tough that way when it's your first gig. So it doesn't matter the type of company, as long as you have that training there is nice. In my personal opinion, like if I had a really close friend that wanted to be a DevOps engineer or a sibling that wanted to be one, I would just tell them to find some type of cloud native environment, an environment that's already leveraging DevOps technologies. So usually these places will have someone that's been there for 2 or 3 years that championed DevOps for them, and now it's a well-oiled machine. And that's usually when they call them site reliability engineers, when DevOps is already in place, as opposed to a DevOps engineer. That's probably one of the things that a lot of people will agree on. A DevOps engineer brings DevOps, whereas a site reliability engineer is someone who's already in that well-oiled DevOps machine and just doing a lot of maintenance. So that's what I recommend. If you can find a company, it's a lot of ifs, but if it's a company out there that's cloud native, leveraging DevOps for a couple years, and then you're going to learn all the tricks from the DevOps engineer who brought all that to them. That's probably your best bet to learn the most and the quickest. Who might hire you? At this point, it always depends on the company, what they're looking for. In all reality, you'll probably get a quicker win if you have probably some type of solid degree, like it sounds like you guys are probably going to have, with maybe a much larger company that's not necessarily cloud native. that's not necessarily leveraging the best DevOps practices, they'll call you a DevOps engineer. They'll give you a fancy title or whatever, and you'll probably be using some good tech, and maybe you will have a couple mentors, but you'll probably get a quicker role with a much, say, larger company or a well-established company that's been around, hundreds of years, like a JP Morgan or or a Johnson & Johnson, something like that. And they'll be calling it DevOps, but it won't necessarily always be the best training, so to speak. So that's the only thing I would recommend. If you can hold out just a hair longer and maybe try and find a company that's smaller with someone who's brought DevOps to them that you can learn directly from, that's what I think would be like the really secret sauce out there if you can find it. Not necessarily the big ones that are going to throw a whole lot of cash at you immediately. That could be your second move, which I see a lot of people do. But usually the first, it's nice to get that mentorship. Experience on your next move, well, it's probably going to be your first role, right? After you leave this class, it's probably going to be your first, role in the workforce. So I wouldn't necessarily have a whole lot to mentor you on there. But as far as the experience that I would say, if you're looking for your second or third role, it always comes down to, again, have you worked with these tools in production? That's huge. That's what all these companies want to see. The proof of concept, it's a tough sell. It just is, because you haven't seen things break. You haven't been burnt, so to speak, with these things live. So that's what they need. Anybody have, any opinions on how long you should stay in jobs or anything like that? Because I've been in IT recruitment for 5 years, and when I first started, it was really an eye-opener for me how different industries are. But you guys have any opinions or anything you've been told? Oh, yeah.
Usually 2 or 3 years, depending on where you start, and also depends on the company. Like if it's a smaller company, you want to just try moving around a little bit, get your experience in various areas, and then try going into like a more stable position afterwards. It's
I'll agree with you on the whole. It does depend on the company, and yeah, it certainly does. Usually, I was surprised, especially because when I first started IT recruitment quite a while ago, I'd see people jump from say 1 year, 9 months. I mean, just crazy, just moving around all the time. It would drive me nuts if I was doing it. But we'll see it out there when it's a really hot market. At the end of the day, the longer that you are with a company, the better. I think genuinely, probably the 2 to 3 year slot looks really awesome on a resume. If there's, say, a minimum out there, again, I can only speak for the DevOps world right now. Over the last 2 years, I've been doing DevOps hiring. I would probably say at an absolute minimum, 1.5 to 2 years, minimum 1.5 to 2 years. Anything longer than that is really great. It's cake, it's gravy, but there tend to be so many opportunities out there. It depends on, I think, mostly what your ambitions are, though. If you want to enter a company and really say grow with them, then great. Stay as long as you need. But there are other people out there that really want to make just financial moves. They'll stay in 1.5 years in a DevOps role, and then they'll move to another SRE role or a DevOps role with a company, and they'll get an insane amount of increase in their salary. I've seen it multiple times where the salaries increase like crazy. As far as learning purposes go, I would always recommend to stay when you're junior, always. I'm not saying to just jump around for cash. I'm just saying that you will see a bunch of offers out there if you do stay down a DevOps and site reliability path. It's always going to be out there. It's always going to be tempting. Big companies, small ones, they're all going to be throwing all different offers at you. It's just the nature of the beast. So while it could be tempting, I would just recommend, at least when you're quite junior, the 2 to 3 year slot is quite good. Anything beyond that is great also. Probably the biggest thing I would say is that keeping up with the market. What are other companies doing? If I was giving this talk, say, 10, 11 months ago, something like Docker, or like I said, Mesos or Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, even more orchestration tools in terms of containers and microservices, those would have just been nice to have. Proof of concept, if people saw that on a resume, they'd be like, wow, that's amazing. They've at least touched this stuff. Now that we're 10, 11 months later, it's something that's almost, say, a must out there for, like, say, a 3 or 4 year DevOps engineer. It's in production as well. So that's how quickly the market moves. As far as, doing market research, it's always good going to meetups, seeing what companies are doing, seeing what people are talking about, where they see technology moving, what tools are going to be good. It's not always about tools, but if you can work in the hottest environments that are leveraging the hottest tools, that it just always pretty much covers you for your next role, because it moves fast. I was really surprised. Even things like Google Cloud, when I first started doing DevOps hiring, wasn't really as big. Not many companies were leveraging it completely. There were maybe full-blown AWS environments that just use the little Google Cloud in there. I don't know the real technical reasons why, but nowadays, I say nowadays, probably 15 months later, I'm seeing way more companies out there that are completely Google Cloud. Not heaps of them, but there are a number out there. There are a couple that I work with right now that are all Google Cloud, and they just they're developing in Go all day. It's interesting how it moves, because a little while back, not that long ago, there were really none to be found. And it's just amazing how they all pretty much pop up, or they switch from AWS to Google Cloud. So that's what we'll see a lot of migrations pretty much. And yeah, I did touch on that, how quickly it moves. Yeah, and cloud services as well. You'll see it all the time. People debate about what might be stronger. It always depends on the company. I know with AWS, or I should say Google Cloud tends to be better for much smaller ones out there. AWS can serve companies that are quite much larger. But that's probably one of the things that will, I guess, really be a make or break for companies that I work with. Usually, they won't care about those different tools like CI/CD or config management or containers. They won't care which ones. They'll usually care about which cloud environment you're working with. So again, if I had a sibling or a friend who wanted to be a DevOps engineer and they asked me what type of tools would be nice to have, I would really just recommend sticking with AWS and Google Cloud. If you can find an environment that's working with those, you'll be pretty safe for quite a while as far as moving up the ladder. If you're going to be moving into an Azure environment, I've been doing this DevOps hiring for 2 years now. I think I've only seen one role or one job that I've worked on filling that's been Azure focused. So there are very, very few out there that need DevOps engineers for an Azure environment. Yeah, and I did talk about that as well, how the speed does change the job market. I'm not saying that every month it's going to change and that your job, or at least your current role, is not going to be relevant anymore, but it does happen quickly. I would always at least keep a pulse on it every, say, 6 to 8 months. That's probably a decent metric to go by as far as, keeping yourself relevant. Any other questions? Okay. And that's pretty much it so far. I really hope it was helpful for you. I know I threw a ton at you guys really quickly, but that's I do this stuff every day, so I can rattle it off. Yeah.
So my background is as a developer, and when I encountered DevOps, I recognized that there's a lot of ways we were developing, Unix developers that have come into this. And I feel that even if someone's not going to be a DevOps engineer, understanding this stuff, understanding it as a way of working is important. I'm wondering how much is that recognized in the marketplace? So if people are hiring developers, are they starting to look for developers who are familiar with working this way?
Yeah, very much so, because on my team, on Salt's tech team, we have recruiters that only specialize in front-end development, only specialize in back-end development, full stack, you name it. So, and I hear it all the time when they're speaking on the phone, or I go to their different meetups, and it always comes down to even the job descriptions, they'll come to me asking, is this actually a DevOps job description? Because they have a lot of DevOps tools thrown in there. And it's like, no, it looks like it's strictly a developer. But they want these developers, they want these programmers out there to be relevant with DevOps best practices. Because again, they still have these developers touching Jenkins, still in an AWS environment, still working with things like containers, of course. Containers are probably the most frequent thing I'll see on these software engineer roles that look DevOps-y. So yeah, absolutely, it's becoming much more of a must-have out there.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, big time. Because not everybody goes down the DevOps route. I mean, I totally get that. If you want to just stay strictly an engineer, it really helps, because so many companies are buying into the DevOps movement, so to speak, that it's a must. Was there another question you hear? Yeah.
How do you see the growth of DevOps over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a good call. I definitely think it's going to be around. I don't see it necessarily going anywhere. As far as what exactly is going to happen, I really wouldn't know. I wouldn't know if everyone's going to really want to only want DevOps engineers or ops-focused engineers. Every company is different. As far as where it's going, I don't see cloud going anywhere. I don't see containers going anywhere. The one thing that I would say was pretty interesting, technology-wise, I can't necessarily elaborate all that much, but like I said, configuration management, like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt, probably about 6 or 7 months ago, those things were, yeah, must-haves. Have you worked with these? Nowadays, there are tools out there that like one that HashiCorp came out with called Terraform, that so many more companies are using that one instead of all 4 of those, and that actually has other purposes as well. So it moves too quickly for me to tell. I don't think it's going anywhere, and I think especially with people that are being taught DevOps in colleges and they're coming out as, say, fresh DevOps engineers, it'll be there. It'll probably just be more saturated. There'll be more talent to compete with, and maybe the jumps in salary won't necessarily be as high 5, 10 years down the road, just because there'll be more people doing it. Everyone's already been a DevOps engineer by now, whereas now that's still new and it's still hot. There are those crazy opportunities out there for people. So, and that's my job to know as a recruiter, just to know where the market is that are really going to help people. Yeah.
Follow-up. Do you reckon that the culture of DevOps could become so prevalent that DevOps engineers become eventually obsolete?
The only thing as far as that I've heard people being obsolete is when they're hired on a contract and they automate themselves out of a job. Apparently it's possible with DevOps. Technology-wise, I mean, I hear it all the time. I wouldn't know how to automate myself out of a job, but apparently that is what happens. Maybe 9, 10 months, and then they don't need the DevOps engineer anymore. That's the only time I've heard of it. Usually for full-time roles, there's way more work to be done, but for contracts, it'll be a 9-month contract, and they'll automate themselves out in like 4 or 5 months, just because the work is like pretty small. But I don't think that necessarily answers your question. But as far as becoming obsolete, there's always going to be new companies out there. There's always going to be new startups or new ideas. So they'll always need that first person to be there for 2 or 3 years to champion DevOps for them. But I guess it would just be more saturated, but not obsolete. Maybe there'll be a new methodology out there that you won't even need DevOps anymore. That's the only thing I could think of. Yeah.
Do you think that certifications are a good thing to have? Because I'm saying this because my friend is currently a DevOps engineer for a company.
Oh, cool.
And he suggested me to take like a AWS course to get a certification as like a cloud solution architect.
Yeah.
Thing. Do you think that's a good idea to have a certification as an investment, or not necessarily?
Yeah, short answer, definitely yes. And it's not just because, oh, it's a nice to have thing on a resume. Like I've said, I've been in IT recruitment for over 5 years now. I started off placing Salesforce.com developers, and those are probably the fluffiest certifications I've seen ever in my career so far. And companies would even laugh at them because they just were like, I've heard them referred to as like Mickey Mouse certifications. Like they had a dev certification where you wouldn't even write a line of code to get it. So, and then in the Microsoft space, that wasn't really as big. Within DevOps, the only ones that I would say that companies actually do want to see, it actually would be the AWS ones. There are different levels as well, but yeah, I think your friend is spot on.
Okay,
yeah, it's not going to erase, or it's not going to make up for not having worked with AWS in production. It's not going to make up for It's not going to make up for only working with it in proof of concept. It's not going to replace you never working with AWS. But there are a lot of it holds the most weight so far in any of the industries that I've hired in. So yeah, I would say in this instance, AWS is fine. And also there's a Google Cloud one. It's either coming out or it's already come out. That's another sharp one too, because more companies out there, not just because they're sprouting up as Google Cloud environments, but there are already AWS shops that have Google Cloud thrown in there, or they're moving from AWS to Google Cloud, so that'll help as well. It's not going to erase you never working with it. It's not going to make up for proof of concept stuff, but it actually is recognized more than any other IT area that I've hired in. Anything else?
All right, well, thank you, Michael.
Cool.
That was great.
No, thanks for having me, Gene. Thanks, guys. Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.